JPMorgan Chase loses $2 billion in trading. I'm Louise Story, reporting for Business Day Live. We'll be profiling Mark Zuckerberg and we'll take a look at the student debt problem. But stay tuned also because Jim Stewart is here to talk about business and same-sex marriage. First, I'm joined by Peter Evis from DealBook. Hi, Peter.
Hi, Louise.
So, JPMorgan, people have been sort of attacking the bank because there have been a lot of rumors that they had a huge bet in the derivatives market. And in April, Jamie Dimon, the CEO, was really defensive. So, what's going on? How has his attitude changed since then?
Well, I think he was actually dismissive. He called the whole coverage of this bet a tempest in a teapot. But it turned out yesterday he had to come out and kind of grovel before Wall Street and say, you know what, we actually took a big loss on this trade and we have to fess up to it.
And so do you think that back in April, when people were pointing him to this trade, which did go bad, that he didn't know about it, or that he was just hoping he would fix it by now, or what was up with his dismissive attitude?
Well, that's part of the mystery, and I think the thing we're looking at now is whether or not JP Morgan itself didn't know it had losses, and there was some evidence of that on the call yesterday.
What was the evidence that they didn't know?
They had this risk measurement tool, which they brought in a new one, and that underestimated the losses. And when they put the old one back on, the potential for loss on that trade suddenly ballooned.
Do you think this could even be a potential disclosure issue where they could get in trouble for not using proper risk disclosure back in April?
That's certainly possible.
Okay, so now let's back up. This trade, it was done by a trader in London. People are calling him the London Whale.
Yes.
His name is Bruno Iskil. Who is this guy?
Well, he's a French guy, apparently. He wears black jeans to the office, according to the Wall Street Journal. On Fridays, he takes the train out of Waterloo Station, a place I know well, back to Paris for the weekend, and then comes back on Monday just to do his job in London. I'm not sure he's still going to be there, though.
You know, it's interesting. We have a little bit of a growing tradition of notable French traders on Wall Street, because of course we had the trader at Societe Generale. He was a rogue trader, lost money, and then the Goldman trader, the fabulous Fab, Fabrice Tour. So now we've got a new one, Bruno.
I just wonder what they're teaching them.
And so do we know, did Bruno do this all on his own, or did Jamie Dimon know about this huge derivatives position?
No, Mr. Dimon definitely knew about it. He's very close to that office. He's actually said, I'm on top of this trade, in the past. And so, he must share a lot of the blame.
Okay, so it's not a rogue trader.
No.
And now I threw it out to Twitter this morning. I said, what do people want to know about what happened with this $2 billion loss at JP Morgan? Yeah. And a number of people messaged me and they said they want to know, how is the Federal Reserve going to oversee derivatives and banks like JP Morgan when trades like this can happen in London? So what do you think on that?
Well, I think the Federal Reserve would say we actually have the ability to look at those trades because it is a US registered bank. And then they would say, well, okay, we have 50 people in JP Morgan's offices and we know their positions. But my response would be, well, if that's the case, how did this happen?
Right, how did it happen? Yeah. Could they stop the trade, or could JP Morgan say, too bad, Fed, this is in London, you can't intervene?
Well, I think they might try and say that, but I think the Fed, if it had the spine, would be able to say, no, you've got to stop that. There's a safety and soundness issue here, and a bank regulator can always go back to that and say, this is neither safe nor sound, stop it.
So there are a lot of questions about how the Fed missed this.
Maybe they didn't miss it. Maybe one of the reasons why they're getting out now is the Fed saying, get the heck out.
Now this trade was supposed to be a hedge, which in Wall Street parlance protects you from bad things happening. And it kind of reminds me, during the financial crisis, do you remember all the banks were coming out and saying our hedges didn't work on our mortgage positions?
Right.
So what happened with this hedge?
Well, I think it got too clever by half, as we would say in England. Basically you had a very simple hedge and then you put another hedge on top of that. And then as it got very sophisticated, they would say, but actually quite complicated, one part started showing losses and those losses ballooned. The market sniffed that. Other hedge funds went for, smelled blood and decided to attack the trade.
So they were betting against JP Morgan.
And then I think the thing got out of hand, and then, it was just so large that they couldn't stop the losses. And there could be even more losses from this trade, Mr. Dimon said yesterday.
Now, of course, JP Morgan and the other banks have been down in Washington the last few years, battling tougher regulations on derivatives, and Jamie Dimon has been very vocally against the Volcker rule, which might limit trading like this. So how is this loss going to play into the rules that are still being written down in Washington?
Well, I think it gives anybody in Washington wanting to write stricter rules a lot of evidence to do that, really, because this is clearly, I mean, most people I've spoken to on Wall Street about this, they see this as a definite trade and not a hedge.
So JPMorgan stock is down a bunch this morning. The other banks are not down so much. Are there not concerns in the market that some other banks might have positions like this?
No, that's a really good question. There really isn't that concern out there, because I think what they felt was that JPMorgan got too big for its boots. It tried to do something that others weren't doing, and so, you know, that's why it's only them.
You know, it's so interesting because, of course, JPMorgan invented derivatives, really, in the credit default swaps in the 1990s. And they've really had this story that has come out in the last few years that they were responsible with them and that other banks took them too far. So do you think that this will make a new chapter in the JPMorgan risk management credit derivative story?
Definitely, and it will be very interesting to see how quickly they try and clean things up, because if this continues to show losses, and it may well, then there's going to be some heads rolling, and there'll be a massive rethink about what risk management is and stuff like that, as there should be.
So we'll stay tuned. Thanks so much for joining us,
Peter.
You're
welcome. Right.
As Facebook prepares to go public, one of the big questions is whether Mark Zuckerberg, whose favorite outfit is the hoodie, sweatshirt, and flip-flops, is grown enough to lead a company valued at more than $80 billion. We've got a package on that now.
If all goes as planned, Facebook will go public next week in a deal that could value the company at nearly $100 billion. I'm David Gillen, reporting for the New York Times. A big question, whether founder and CEO Mark Zuckerberg, who turns 28 on Monday, has truly matured from the alpha geek of the social network into a CEO of a global corporation. Rita McGrath, an associate professor at Columbia Business School, teaches an executive course called Leading Strategic Growth and Change, which sounds like a case study of Facebook.
He's not the first very young CEO to lead what subsequently became an extremely important company, so it can be done. One of the things I think is most interesting about the way he's approached that role is he's approached it kind of the way an engineer would approach it. You know, he's sort of said, I'm not naturally that way, but let me study people who are, let me learn from people who are.
As a manager and as a leader.
As a manager and a leader, right, rather than being a strong technical person. And I think he realized that if he wanted to build the company that he had in mind, he would have to master those skills.
We were talking a little bit before the show about how he's learned from failure. I mean, can you get specific there?
Sure. Well, one of his tenets as a leader has been he wants his people working on big problems. He wants them really pushing the envelope. And so you're going to try a lot of things that aren't going to work out. And I would say that he's been one of the more failure-tolerant CEOs that I've met, you know, that I know of, and that's a good thing. The bad thing is some of those failures were pretty bad. I mean, the whole Beacon fiasco, the dust-ups over privacy, the attempt to out Foursquare. I mean, those were all things that were experiments, kind of didn't go well, and each time one of those doesn't go well, you know, he loses people's trust a little bit, and he loses the confidence people have in Facebook to look after their own interests. So it's a very fine line.
Now, one of the things that he's done over the years is built a brain trust, you know, of counselors, advisors, whether it was Steve Jobs, Bill Gates, Mark Andreessen, prominent VC, and so forth. This is something that, you know, it seems absolutely vital to entrepreneurs today. No?
Absolutely, absolutely. And when you consider the kind of company Facebook is, where it's very asset light, you know, it doesn't have, I mean, I'm sure it has patents and things, but it's not a technology company. You know, you're really building something that lives or dies by its wits almost.
Right.
And so having that council of advisors to help fill in the gaps where he doesn't know, and I think he's been really smart about identifying where he really feels he can make the decision, and that's it, that's the way it's going to be, and where other people need to be brought into debate, to discuss, to engage in dialogue, and I think he's been very aggressive about that.
Right, talk just a little bit more too about his hiring. I mean, Sheryl Sandberg is a perfect example of somebody that was a great hire, and in some ways, you know, showed where he was going as a manager and leader.
Absolutely. Well, people like Sheryl were brought into the company very explicitly because A, that wasn't what he wanted to do, and B, he probably wouldn't be very good at it anyway. way. But I think his ability to capture somebody like that, I mean, she left a fabulous position
Absolutely.
before, so,
Sure.
so you
Sure.
know, his ability to attract those kind of people, I think, speaks very well for him as a leader.
Now, there was a bit of a flutter on Wall Street as he was doing the road show for the IPO this week. He shows up in his hoodie. No surprise to anybody who knows him or anybody in Silicon Valley, but the Wall Street types were all like, why can't you just put on a suit? Is this just a cultural thing between Wall Street and Silicon Valley?
It's a huge cultural gap, and it goes back to something that I think hasn't changed about Zuckerberg's focus in his business, and that's been his obsession almost with product excellence. And his whole symbolic presentation goes with that. So I wear a hoodie, who cares what I wear? I live in a modest house, who cares what I drive? I'm caring about the product. Now the minute he comes down here and puts on a Chanel suit and runs around with fancy cufflinks and drives a Maserati, it really kind of flies in the face.
Something else.
It would send a very strong symbolic message. So I actually think he's being smart, and the Wall Street guys need to get over it.
This week, when North Carolina voters weighed in against same-sex marriage, the business community there stayed silent. Columnist Jim Stewart is writing this week about why allowing gay marriage might be good for business. Hey, Jim.
Hi, Louise.
So what was interesting this week, North Carolina, they passed a constitutional ban on gay marriage, but it was so different from what we saw here in New York recently from business leaders.
Oh, it was night and day. I mean, I was very struck when I started looking into this that the business community in North Carolina was just silent. There was not one of the 15 Fortune 500 companies headquartered there, including Bank of America, that came out against the amendment banning gay marriage. Whereas in New York, you saw a rush of companies supporting gay marriage. And now, with the battle going on in Washington State, there's been a parade of major companies, Microsoft, Amazon, Nike, who have rushed forward to really throw their support behind gay marriage and have really been very eloquent about it for business reasons.
What would those business reasons be?
Well, the big one really is attracting and retaining talent. It's not like, oh, the local baker isn't going to get as many wedding cakes. I think that trivializes the issue. This is really a fascinating area of some burgeoning scholarship. And it's not really about gay people, because there really aren't that many to make a huge difference. In fact, there are only 640-some thousand married or gay couples in the entire country, according to the latest census. But it's about people who have affinities with people like that. And to me, the most interesting study was one that showed a high concentration of gay people with high economic growth and especially high-tech information technology growth and entrepreneurial job creation. And that's mostly people who just want to be in a creative environment.
Well, that's really interesting. So it's more about having the open attitudes. These studies say it has to do with the open attitudes correlates with high economic growth. Where are some of these places?
Yeah, well, I mean, the highest concentrations of gay people are in cities like San Diego, Washington, D.C., Austin, Texas. It's not, oddly enough, Manhattan. San Francisco is one. And you do see these very entrepreneurial cultures in these areas and a lot of high-tech growth.
Now, Austin is in Texas.
Yes, it is.
And Texas does not allow gay marriage. So why do you think Austin has a high gay population, even despite that?
Well, you have these pockets of tolerance, and North Carolina has one in Research Triangle, by the way, which voted against the amendment and is one of the highest growth areas in the state. So you do have these pockets of tolerance, a welcoming environment, and demographers pointed out to me that most gay people are going to move like everyone else will move because they get a great job,
Well,
and they
particularly
want to be
in this economy.
In this economy, and also in that environment, they're going to feel comfortable even if there are these state laws. In fact, I spoke to somebody in Georgia yesterday who worked for Home Depot, and he didn't even know that Georgia had a constitutional amendment against it. And
now,
again,
how many
Atlanta is
states?
another one of these
North
pockets.
Carolina becomes the
30th to have a constitutional amendment. But there are currently 8 states that permit gay marriage or civil unions in one form or another. That means there are 42 states that basically now prohibit it, either through constitutional amendment or through a state law.
When did most of those 30 states pass these bans?
Well, that's an important point, because they really started to flourish in the late 90s and the early 2000s when the very idea of gay marriage first raised its head. But this is an area where social attitudes are evolving very rapidly. In fact, again, some researchers told me they've never seen an issue of this magnitude where the opinion is changing so quickly, especially among young people. And then that's another issue, because these big companies want to attract the best and the brightest young people, which is the future of these companies.
Well, I mean, one of the biggest things that I hear from business executives is that talent is so hard to find. And so,
Right.
do you think that areas that ban it that companies would leave or move some of their operations, or how will this play out?
Well, I think it's not going to see a sea change because of any of this. You know, Lowe's is headquartered in North Carolina, and they're not going to suddenly move to California or New York. But what you do see here is a relatively small but extremely important part of the population, gay and straight, that are, number one, they're very mobile, they're very highly educated, they're affluent, they are entrepreneurial, they're starting new businesses, they're regenerating older businesses. This may be a small group, but it's vitally important for companies that want to grow, especially in a new economy where, you know, let's face it, affluence is not going to come from having a big call center tucked away in some, you know, suburban mall somewhere. You've got to have creativity and new ideas, and this correlates very highly with tolerance of gay marriage.
And so perhaps as this kind of creative class comes up in these companies, maybe they'll even get more vocal in their views, if that's the case.
Yes, and I talked to some people in North Carolina who were pushing against the amendment, and they said that the focus now is going to be to try to harness business support. They admit they failed, that, you know, North Carolina culturally just wasn't ready for this. People were very timid. I should say an exception was the CEO of Duke Energy, Jim Rogers, who made a very eloquent speech in support of gay marriage. But most North Carolina business leaders, they just sat on their hands and did nothing. And I think a key in states like that is going to be harnessing the business community.
Power.
Because he said they privately acknowledge this. They want to compete with the states that allow gay marriage, and they need to do it, but they're not yet willing to step out and say it. And frankly, Jim Rogers at Duke Energy compared it to the Jim Crow laws that once prevailed in North Carolina and said 10 years from now, we'll look back and say this is just as bad.
Well, Jim, thanks so much for joining us.
Sure.
Finally, rising college tuition and fewer employment opportunities are leaving many college graduates stuck with part-time jobs and loans that they can't pay back. The Times is looking at the economic issues facing recent graduates in a coming series. Brent McDonald offers a preview for us from New Paltz, New York.
Are you still working a bit? Or are we all set? Absolutely. May I wrap it for you?
Main Street in New Paltz, New York, is a typical state school campus town. It's lined with cafes, music stores, and boutique shops, places that have traditionally offered part-time jobs and pocket cash for students. But after years of tuition hikes and high unemployment, college graduates, like Dana Carrico, are now clinging to these jobs as they struggle to pay down daunting amounts of student debt.
I work 3 jobs. I work 35 hours a week here at this restaurant. I'm a freelance tutor. I do some freelance editing, and in the nice weather, I work as a landscaper. New Paltz is a magical place, and I didn't quite think in terms of money when I came here. I thought in terms of experience and beauty. I studied English. I didn't understand what $60,000 was. Imagine mortgaging a house before you'd ever even purchased your first car. That's what it's like. Recently had the terribly humiliating experience of having my loan companies call my co-signer, an aunt. You know, when she got that call, she just sort of immediately thinks, well, Dana's floundering.
That's all for today. Please stay with us online at nytimes.com for our continuing coverage. I'm Louise Story, reporting for Business Day Live. Thanks for watching.